Those of you that have taken the time to absorb the information and analysis that I've provided in the supplements to the Gettysburg Battle Walk, I want to give you a succinct statement of the bare facts that support your conclusion as to the actual instructions, whether communicated verbally or in writing, that General Lee caused to be transmitted to Richard Ewell on the 29th of June at Carlisle, to A.P. Hill on the 29th, and to Jubal Early on the 29th forward. The point is to provide you in a nutshell with these basic facts, to distill them out of the larger picture that I presented over an hour and a half in the Part 1 and Part 2 supplements. As an introduction, I want to quote from Isaac Trimble's piece that he had published in the Southern Historical Papers. This is the Southern Historical Society's papers. I think the date would be about 1898. Trimble was an engineer, a civil engineer before the war. He was employed with the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, the Pennsylvania Central Railroad. He was a Marylander or Pennsylvanian, one or the other, I forget which. Very knowledgeable about the terrain. He was an older fella, I think in his 60s. He was a friend of General Lee. He reports having a conference with General Lee at Chambersburg. Now, whenever these witnesses give us a narrative that tells us their what they hear General Lee say, we have to separate the wheat from the chaff, the fantasy from reality, the embellishment from the hard fact. And certainly in the context of Trimble's rendition of what came down between himself and General Lee, we have to take the editorial remarks with a grain of salt here. But this is what he writes. On June 27th, in the afternoon, I met General Lee at his tent. He called me to where he was seated and, unfolding a map of Pennsylvania, asked me about the topography of the countryside. Unquote. Now, this would certainly be something that we can accept as being reasonably true, given who Trimble was, given his relationship with General Lee, and given his knowledge of the area. Trimble goes on. After my description of the country, Lee remarked, and I think I repeat his words nearly verbatim, and then Trimble gives us quotation marks for what he's telling us Lee said to him. Now, this is a hearsay statement. We don't have Trimble under oath. We don't have him on the witness stand. We're not going to be able to cross-examine him. This is what he wants us to believe General Lee said to him. Quote, our army is in good spirits and can be concentrated on any one point in 24 hours or less. I have not heard that the enemy have crossed the Potomac and am waiting to hear from Stuart. When the enemy hears where we are, they will make forced marches to interpose their forces between us and Baltimore and Philadelphia. They will come up, probably through Frederick, broken down with hunger and hard marching, strung out on a long line and much demoralized when they come into Pennsylvania. I shall throw an overwhelming force on their advance, crush it, follow up the success, drive one corps back on another, and by successive repulses and surprises before they can concentrate, create a panic and virtually destroy the army, unquote. Now, as reasonable people, all of us, we ought to have some difficulty with the embellishment that Trimble gives us. Is it probable that General Lee would have spoken in such rhetorical terms under the circumstances? I doubt it. But is the core of the statement, the bald statement of fact that Lee gives, Trimble says in this statement, is that accurate? The enemy will come up, probably through Frederick, broken down from hard marching, strung out on a long line. When they come into Pennsylvania, I shall throw an overwhelming force on their advance, crush it, follow up the success, drive one corps back on another. I suggest that that's the substance of what General Lee's state of mind was from the winter of 1863 when he began to plan his campaign, and he did not waver from it at any time, and that therefore it seems to me that Trimble's statement to that extent has some significant probative force. Now, Trimble goes on to tell us what General Lee said next. This may be dramatics on the part of Trimble, or it may be true. We weren't there. Quote, at the conclusion of our interview, Lee laid his hands on the map over Gettysburg and said, hereabout we shall probably meet the enemy and fight a great battle. Unquote. Trimble then says that he was sent by Lee to Ewell's headquarters. Now, this is on the afternoon of June 27th. Trimble tells us in his article that he arrived in Carlisle, I'm pronouncing that word right, on Sunday, June 28th. And he tells us that that night, Tuesday, now this can't be accurate because Tuesday in 1863 was June the 30th. So when he says that night, we don't know what night he's talking about. It's unclear. He says, Ewell received by courier from Lee a dispatch that the enemy had crossed the Potomac. And with the dispatch was an order, quote, to cross at once the South Mountain and march to Cashtown or Gettysburg according to circumstances, unquote. And then Trimble, in italics, writes next in his article, quote, these were the words, unquote. So Trimble wants us to believe that he saw the written message that had been delivered to Ewell probably sometime in the dark early hours of the morning of June 29, perhaps later on June 29, and that he read it, and that he, 25 years later, has retained an accurate memory precisely down to the specific words that were written. Ordered to cross at once the South Mountain and march to Cashtown or Gettysburg according to circumstances, unquote. Now, when you look at the screen image and you see the relationship of the three divisions of Ewell's corps, the middle division coming from Carlisle southward to Heidlersburg being Rhodes' division, I know you all can recognize immediately the difficulty in executing this specific order that Trimble tells us emphatically Ewell received while he was at Carlisle. Cross at once the South Mountain and march to Cashtown or Gettysburg, according to circumstances. As a matter of fact, it's undisputed that Ewell marched Rhodes' division directly to Heidlersburg from Carlisle. Now, about 8 miles south of Heidlersburg, almost on a direct line, is Gettysburg. But Cashtown is not in the line of march from Carlisle to Heidlersburg to Gettysburg. It's to the west, about 12 miles. So if in fact Trimble's statement is accurate, we have no explanation for why Ewell marched to Heidlersburg. When he crossed the South Mountain at the location indicated by the red line, he ought to have turned. If Ewell's order was to march directly to Cashtown, he should have turned to the south and come down the east side of the South Mountain directly to Cashtown through Biglersville and through Arendtsville, where there is good roads today as well as in 1863. He didn't do that. I think it's somewhat impossible for Ewell to begin marching with that kind of an order. He's got to choose one place or the other. The idea of waiting for according to circumstances isn't going to help him march. He can't march to a place called according to circumstances. He's got to march either to Cashtown or to Gettysburg. He's got to make a choice if that was in fact his instructions. So this instruction, as Trimble gives it to us, is extremely ambiguous. It seems as if it's impossible of execution, if that is all there was to the message. Trimble goes on to tell us that on Tuesday, June the 30th, quote, Ewell started from Carlisle with Rhodes' division and by an easy march reached Heidlersburg before sundown. General Johnson was left to guard trains, and General Early had not returned from York. So despite the fact he received an order, according to Trimble, to march to Cashtown or Gettysburg according to circumstances, it appears that Ewell marched toward Gettysburg by marching to Heidlersburg. Now, the night of June the 30th, at Heidlersburg, Ewell had a conference with Jubal Early, who had marched on the same day from York through East Berlin to the vicinity of Heidlersburg. And he did this because on his line of march, when he had reached the vicinity of East Berlin, Early's going to tell us that he received a message from Ewell telling him to march toward Heidlersburg. So if we're going to reconcile Trimble's story with the facts, the objective, undisputed facts of the case, we're going to have to assume that Ewell received a further message from Lee during his march on June 30th that directed him to go to Heidlersburg. And on that basis, Ewell sent a messenger to Early, who he knew was marching west, to meet him at Heidlersburg. And that message on June the 30th, that it seems clear must have come to Ewell from Lee, is not available to us. There's no evidence of its existence anywhere. Now, Trimble tells us that during this consultation, Ewell was aware that the 11th Corps was at Gettysburg. And if Ewell was aware of that, then he was also aware that the 1st Corps under Reynolds was at Gettysburg. Yet, in reality, neither one of these corps was at Gettysburg on June the 30th. Reynolds was 5 miles south of Gettysburg the night of June 30th. So Trimble is in error here. And in that context, Trimble tells us that Ewell was, quote, undecided what to do under his order, unquote. The order was read over repeatedly and variously commented on, unquote. Now, we're supposed to presume that Trimble's referring to this order that he tells us he quoted with specificity, the first order. The one that we agree is ambiguous. Well, aren't we already past that order? Because a second order had to have come to tell Ewell to go to Heidlersburg, and Ewell then told Early to go to Heidlersburg. Again, as students, there's a lot of work to be done here, nailing down what we can determine from the evidence is clear versus what is not clear in the story these witnesses give us. We want to always try to compare what the witnesses tell us with what the evidence shows us they actually did. And then Trimble tells us that on July 1, the march reached Middleton. And I'm unable to show you Middleton on this image screen because the town no longer exists on the map. And I don't have the old map in front of me to help you understand where Middleton is. But Middleton is somewhere between Cashtown and Heidlersburg. That point was reached about 10 a.m. And it was at that point that Ewell received a third communication from General Lee, which ordered Hill to march to Gettysburg. And on the basis of that, Rhodes' division was ordered to march for the same place. Now, returning to the official reports, that are in the record of the rebellion. I've got a few quotations I want to read to you. In preparing the previous videos, the effort of reviewing this material did bring to my mind the necessity to make a clear record about what these officers said in their official reports. Let's look at on this point, this concentration issue. And in the course of doing this, we're setting aside Venable's sketch from memory. We're setting that aside as if it did not exist. And we're looking at this image picture, which accurately identifies what each of these officers actually did with what they wrote in their reports about what they did. So let's start with Lee's report dated July 31, 1863. One sentence is all we really need here. Quote, "It was resolved to concentrate east of the mountains. Longstreet and Hill were directed to proceed from Chambersburg to Gettysburg, to which point Ewell was also instructed to march from Carlisle." Unquote. Now, if we had nothing else to deal with in evidence here, and this was all that was presented to us, we would have no difficulty in understanding that it means exactly what it says. Lee ordered his army to concentrate at Gettysburg. That's what that means. Now, in the final report, the so-called final report that's dated January of 1864, I have two sentences to extract from the entire report that are relevant here. Quote, "It was determined to concentrate east of the mountains. Hill's corps was accordingly ordered to move toward Cashtown on the 29th, and Longstreet to follow on the 30th. Ewell was recalled from Carlisle and directed to join the army at Cashtown or Gettysburg as circumstances might require." Period, unquote. Does that ring a bell? It seems to me obvious that Trimble, in 1898, when he was writing for the Southern Historical Papers, seized upon that specific language in General Lee's final report and adopted it as if it was something he actually heard on the 27th when he was in conference with General Lee. And that is a different statement entirely from the plain statement Lee made in his report dated July 31, 1863, just 25 days after the battle occurred. How Ewell is supposed to decide what circumstances require as he begins the march from Carlisle escapes my intelligence completely. That just doesn't make any sense. It's not an intelligent order you could expect a reasonable person in General Lee's shoes to issue. How is the poor devil supposed to execute that order? The second sentence in the final report of Lee's that's relevant here is this, quote, "Heth's division reached Cashtown on the 29th. And the following morning, Pettigrew's brigade found Gettysburg occupied by the enemy. Hill arrived with Pender's division the evening of the 30th, and the following morning on July 1 advanced with these two divisions." Unquote. Now, whatever the historians and civil war writers want to do in using Heth's story about going to Gettysburg for shoes and telling us that the march of Hill's divisions to Gettysburg was unauthorized by General Lee, they're ignoring what Lee has had written in this report. From that language, it's hard to deny, it seems to me, ladies and gentlemen, that General Lee ordered Hill to advance to Gettysburg. Hill's report, dated November 1863, has just 2 sentences in it that are relevant to the inquiry. Quote, "On the morning of the 29th, I was at Fayetteville." That's just at the edge of the west side of the South Mountain on the road between Chambersburg and Cashtown. Quote, "I was directed to move on the road toward Gettysburg in the direction of York and to cross the Susquehanna River, menacing the communications of Harrisburg with Philadelphia, and to cooperate with Ewell, acting as circumstances might require," unquote. Now, having reviewed all of the reports during that hour and a half presentation on the earlier videos, this strikes me as something that's obvious now about Hill's. Hill has thrown in this business about marching in the direction of York, crossing the Susquehanna, as further support for the idea that nobody planned on destroying the Wrightsville Bridge. That's all. This is giving Early some more defense to the idea that the bridge, that he had not meant to destroy the bridge, much less the town. That explains, that business about the war crime issue, it seems to me, does reasonably explain the various references made by Ewell, made by Early, and made by Hill in these reports about that bridge, because you're obviously not going to get on the other side of the river unless that bridge is there, and you're not going to march there unless you expect the bridge to be there, which means the inference is nobody planned on destroying the bridge, they planned on using the bridge. That's the only relevance this business about that bridge has to this case. Hill goes on, quote, "On the 29th, I moved Heth to Cashtown, following on the 30th with Pender, directing Anderson to follow. On arriving at Cashtown, Heth reported the enemy was at Gettysburg. A courier was dispatched to Lee with this information, and a courier was sent to Ewell informing him that I intended to advance the next morning and discover what was in my front, the next morning being July 1. Well, that's the message that Ewell would have received after he had completed his march on June 30th from Carlisle to Heidlersburg. So we still don't have any intelligent explanation for why Ewell has actually marched to Heidlersburg on June the 30th instead of marching in the direction of Cashtown. And then Hill tells us on July 1 at 5 a.m., Heth took up the march. About 3 miles from Gettysburg, Heth encountered the advance of the enemy. Let's turn to Ewell's report, dated 1863. He doesn't give a month or a year. Quote, "I was ordered by Lee to join the main body of the army at Cashtown near Gettysburg." Notice the play on the words here on this business about linking Gettysburg and Cashtown. Trimble, Lee, and now Ewell. Lee says Ewell was instructed to march to Gettysburg from Carlisle in his July 31, 1863 report. But in his January 1864 report, Lee says Ewell was directed to join the army at Cashtown or Gettysburg as circumstances might require. Hill says he was ordered to move on the road toward Gettysburg in the direction of York. In other words, he was definitely going to move through Gettysburg. And then Ewell in his report says he was ordered to join the army at Cashtown near Gettysburg. But he didn't march to Cashtown. He marched toward Gettysburg. So, in measuring what he says with what he did, we have to leave the situation with some heavy suspicion that what he says is not accurate. On the night of June 30, Ewell tells us he had Rodes' division in Heidlersburg with Early 3 miles off in camp. Johnson at that time was between Green Village and Scotland, which is the red arrow, the red line down from Shippensburg. Quote, at Heidlersburg, I received orders from Lee to proceed to Cashtown or Gettysburg as circumstances might dictate. And a note came from Hill saying he was at Cashtown, unquote. Again, the language is very important here. Now, it does make sense. If you're General Ewell at Heidlersburg, to receive a message from Lee the night of June the 30th, bringing you up to date on what's going on. And yes, we've got a lot of troops that are arriving in the area of Cashtown, and if you receive this ambiguous message from Lee the night of June 30th at Heidlersburg, you're being informed that we're going to make up our minds on July 1 as circumstances arise, as the situation evolves. We're going to be reacting to that evolving situation, and I'm warning you, Ewell, that you may have to move toward Cashtown or toward Gettysburg as I decide the circumstances require. Now, in that context, this use of the phrase Cashtown or Gettysburg as circumstances might require makes a lot of sense. It's just a preliminary heads up. This is what's going to happen tomorrow, one thing or the other. Be on your toes. That's an entirely different situation, receiving that kind of a communication once Ewell is at Heidlersburg than it is before he even begins to march from Carlisle. So it just doesn't make any sense. It seems obvious that Ewell received an instruction from Lee while he was at Carlisle sometime on June 29th to march to Heidlersburg and to send a courier to Early and tell him to march toward Heidlersburg. And then once you people get to Heidlersburg, I'll be telling you what you're going to do next. Makes a lot of sense. Now, Ewell goes on in his report to say, quote, on July 1, I moved Rodes toward Cashtown. See, so during the night, when he had Trimble and he had Early there, and Trimble tells us how confusing things were, Ewell decided on his own that he would start to march on the morning of July 1 toward Cashtown as the situation was evolving. It doesn't mean that he expected to get to Cashtown, but he chose to start to move toward Cashtown. And one would not be surprised at this, since he's already got his division under Johnson and supposedly moving toward Cashtown. Before reaching Middletown, Middletown is a place on the map that doesn't exist anymore either. But as I say, it's between Cashtown and Gettysburg and Heidlersburg. Quote, before reaching Middletown, I received notice from Hill that he was advancing upon Gettysburg. This is consistent with what Hill told us in his report. A courier was dispatched to Ewell informing him I intended to advance the next morning, July 1, and discover what was in my front. And it's at this point, circumstances now requiring it, that Ewell turns toward Gettysburg. He notified Lee of his movement, and at this point, on his march from the vicinity of Hydarsburg, Middletown, toward Gettysburg, a fourth instruction came to him from Lee, he tells us, which also, of course, is not available to us as evidence. Quote, I was informed by Lee that in case we found the enemy's force very large, he did not want a general engagement brought on till the rest of the army came up, unquote. Now, the historians and the Civil War writers seize upon that specific language as if it was something that was in Lee's mind 24, 48 hours earlier. And they connect it to Hill. And they claim that Hill somehow, on his own hook, marched off toward Gettysburg against General Lee's attitude, which was not to bring on a general engagement until the entire army is up. The historians, Civil War writers have turned the evidence on its head. They've twisted the situation to create an illusion that doesn't exist in the record. And the key language in that particular dialogue, that particular phrase or message that Ewell says he received from Lee, is the phrase, quote, very large, unquote. The historians, Civil War writers ignore what that means. Yes, if you're in the shoes of General Lee, in this evolving situation, you're planning on falling on the enemy and attacking him from two directions. You're learning as you go how strong this enemy force is in your front. If it is weaker than the force that you're organizing to bring against it from two directions, Cashtown and Hydarsburg, if it's smaller than that force, you're going to attack it. If it turns out as you engage, as you come in contact and you feel them out, you realize that this force is equal to or greater than the force you're organizing against it, then it's very large and you're not going to want to attack it. You're going to have to wait until you concentrate, which means it's going to be a pitched battle between concentrated armies, something you certainly don't want to have happen here. So you students that are coming up the ladder here and have any interest in this matter really have to sit down with a blank slate in front of you and reconstruct the evidence, paying specific attention to what these people clearly did and measure what they say by those actions, taking with a grain of salt any hearsay statement, any statement of any officer about somebody else said, somebody said. Notice that we're not paying any attention to Venable's sketch from memory in this scenario. Early's report has a couple of lines. Quote, on the evening of the 29th, I received through Captain Johnson, aide to Ewell, a copy of a note from Lee and also verbal instructions which required me to join the corps on the west side of the South Mountain, unquote. Well, if he received this the evening of the 29th, the courier bringing it by horseback would have had to have ridden about 25 to 30 miles, maybe about 38, 40 miles from Carlisle, which would be about an 8 to 10 hour ride, which means he would have left, the courier would have left Carlisle, would have left Ewell about 10 a.m. the morning of the 29th, which means sometime earlier than that, Ewell received his message from Lee. Now, why Early tells us this business about moving to the western side of the South Mountain, that's confusing, isn't it? That seems to implicate Venable's sketch from memory, doesn't it? Something about, I wrote you last night to tell you to move to Chambersburg, but now I'm writing you to tell you to move to Heidlersburg, being ready to move either to Cashtown or Gettysburg. See, that sketch from memory has also been reconstructed. It's a red herring. It's been thrown into the record by Venable for some specific purpose, relative to the confusion about this order business. However, since Early has thrown it into his scenario, it suggests that Ewell might have indeed gotten something from Lee's headquarters at an earlier time about coming back down the Cumberland Valley to Cashtown. And that Ewell incorporated that idea in the message he sent by courier to Early, which Early received the evening of the 29th. Otherwise, we're going to have difficulty understanding why Early threw that in there. Again, we don't have anything from Early other than this report that helps us understand this. Early goes on. At daylight on the 30th, I moved by Wiggletown and East Berlin in the direction of Heidlersburg. So even though Early's told us that, he's supposed to be marching now to the western side of the South Mountain, and in the letter he wrote to H.P. McCullen, he gave us a map that included Arendtsville and the road to Shippensburg. He goes on to tell us he's not going there, he's going to Heidlersburg. So Heidlersburg is definitely the center of the vortex in this whole situation. It's where Ewell marched to. It's where Early marched to. It's where Hill sent his courier. So it seems to me Heidlersburg is supposed to be the concentration point for Ewell's corps, with the understanding that further instructions will come as to where the concentrated corps is supposed to move. It's going to be obvious it's going to move to Cashtown if Hill finds that the enemy force in his front is larger than Lee likes. If Hill finds the enemy force in front of him to be weaker than the force Lee is gathering against it, then Lee's going to tell Ewell to march to Gettysburg, which is what happens. So it does depend, at the end of the day here, we're beginning to see some intelligent continuity here. Once Lee has ascertained by the contact that the front of Hill's corps is going to make with the enemy force arriving on McPherson's Ridge, once he ascertains the strength of that force and how much additional force is behind it and how far away it is, it's at that point that he's going to decide where Ewell is going. That's getting to be quite clear here. So you got to be able to sift through the fog that has been laid down by 150 years of misinterpretation and sloppy writing by historians and Civil War writers to form a more intelligent and accurate picture of what this general is actually doing at this time. Okay, Early tells us he camped 3 miles from Heidlersburg. He saw Ewell the night of the 30th, and he was informed that, quote, the object was to concentrate the corps at or near Cashtown, unquote. and Early received directions to move to that point next day. Rhodes to move by Middleton and Arendtsville, Early to move by Hunterstown and Mumminsburg. So Ewell decided, Ewell's confusion at this point, at June the 30th, the evening at Heidlersburg, is, where does Lee want me to march in the morning? Well, he should have waited until he got instructions from Lee where he was to march in the morning. He chose to march toward Cashtown, no doubt, because he wanted to get connected to his 3rd Division, which he had sent off for reasons we can't fathom at the moment, through Shippensburg to Fayetteville to the Cashtown Gap. Okay, Early completes his contribution to this scenario. Quote, I decided the morning of July 1 to march by way of Heidlersburg, and then from that point get on the Mumminsburg Road. And that's what he did. And then he tells us, quote, after passing Mumminsburg, I got a message from Ewell informing me that Hill was moving toward Gettysburg, and that Rhodes had turned toward that place from Middletown, and I was directed to move toward Gettysburg. So we got a 5th instruction that came from Lee to Ewell that's not recorded in the famous Gettysburg letter book. The fact that all these messages, by now we have at least 7. We have the message that Lee sent to Ewell that prompted Ewell to order Early to march to York on June 25, missing from the letter book. We have the order that may exist telling Ewell to march to Chambersburg on the 27th or 28th, missing from the letter book. And we have these 3 or 4 instructions that Ewell received, including the one on the morning of the 29th. The two on the 30th, and this one on the July 1, missing from the letter book. Now the absence of these important messages from that letter book tell us that this letter book is a fabrication. It's a tool that was used by these staff officers in lieu of the actual orders over a period of 7 days that generally issued to these various officers. There's just no rational explanation otherwise for the absence of all these orders from that letter book. All right, that's the evidence that you can use in relation to the image that you see in front of you here. And you can see there's work to do. There's work to do. You got to scour those depositories. See if you can find any of these orders. Some of you can take that letter book apart and make a careful outline, an index of what exactly is in that letter book, and why are these items in this letter book, and what relevance do they have, and are they the only existing piece of evidence to support the fact that such a communication was issued? For example, I think in the letter book you'll find a letter recorded there written by General Lee to President Davis prior to June the 26th. Is this the only existing copy of the supposed letters to President Davis? Or do the original letters received by President Davis that are recorded in this letter book in existence as a separate object? Important to know this.